Hey guys, Dave with the First Place Auto Parts today in the shop. Thanks for joining me. One thing I know for certain in the garage is that if you play around with motorcycles, cars, boats, or tractors, eventually someday you're going to need to use a torque wrench. In today's video, we're going to take a look at torque wrenches, some common do's and don'ts, and the top tips that it comes to get the most out of the torque wrench in your toolbox. Please consider subscribing to our First Place Auto Parts YouTube channel. We'll continually be adding updated videos every week, whether we're covering how to install new products or going to some really cool car guy events. I'm sure you're going to want to see. You may have heard the old saying that goes something like this: you tighten a bolt until it strips, back it off a quarter turn, and then you call it done. That's just not how you tighten a bolt that you want to stay in place. Enter the torque wrench. Almost all bolts in certain applications will have some sort of a torque reading. And what the torque wrench does is it essentially, when you torque a bolt down, what you're trying to achieve is the correct amount of bolt stretch that actually applies the clamping force with the bolt head. So we're stretching a bolt, and it's critical that we get the correct amount of torque applied to it, and that's where a torque wrench comes into play. There are several different types of torque wrenches, but the ones that most guys are going to find either at their local tool store, their parts store, or probably in their toolbox is going to be one of two types. The first type is a beam type torque wrench, and this torque wrench is very simple. It's easy to use, but it's also critical that you keep that wrench protected in your toolbox, because that bar that you use and the pointer itself is easily knocked out of adjustment. So if you use a beam type torque wrench, make sure that you either put it in some sort of a container or you keep it outside of the toolbox, someplace where it's safe. The other downside to a beam type torque wrench is the numbers can be hard to read when you're actually using it, especially if you're going for a certain amount of torque that's like, say, over 45, 50 foot-pounds. It's hard to control and then look at the numbers at the same time, so that's why most people will use what's called the click type torque wrench. That's number 2. That's probably the most commonly found torque wrenches in most people's toolbox, and it's what I use as well. Click torque wrenches come in a lot of different sizes for almost every application, such as 1/4 inch, 1/2 inch, and 3/4 inch socket size. The 1/4 inch socket size is for your smaller applications, typically lighter loads. It may be bolts that you're tightening in inch pounds instead of foot pounds. But the rest of them all have an application, whether it's due to space limitations or the size of the socket, which typically also has something to do with the amount of foot-pounds of torque you're going to apply. A click-type torque wrench has a couple of things that make it pretty easy to use. The first is the fixed part of the beam or the ratchet itself. The other is this rotating handle that's knurled typically. On the beam, we'll have the foot-pounds rated in 10-foot spans, so it goes from 10 to 20 to 30 to 40 to 50 on up to 90 or 100. And then on your handle, it'll have the individual foot-pounds. So if you had to dial in 30 foot-pounds, what you would do is you would turn this lower knurled knob to 30, and then you would find say it was 34 or 35, you would put it to number 4 or number 5 on the handle, and then you would be done. So it's pretty straightforward to use. A lot of these are a ratcheting type. They'll have a lever on the back that you can go forward or backward with. We'll talk about that in a little bit, about how to use that or whether you should use that feature. But using a torque wrench is simple. And then once you tighten this down, it makes an audible click. Once you get to the correct foot-pound reading or inch-pound in the 1/4 inch size, once you hear that click, you're done. So there's 9 things that you probably need to know about a torque wrench. And the first one is that when you're tightening down a bolt and you hear that click, you're done. So one click and done with a torque wrench. You'll see some people actually taking the torque wrench and trying to make sure it clicks again, or continually hitting the bolt to make sure it's clicked a couple of times. What you're doing, or what the person's doing, is they continually go back and try to find that clicking point as they're over tightening the bolt. And as you can see, some of these get pretty long, which means they can apply a pretty decent amount of leverage over the size of a typical ratchet. So one click and you're done with a click type torque wrench. The next thing that we're going to talk about on a torque wrench is setting the stop on the end of this thing. Once you've dialed the torque in with the lower part of the handle and you found where you want to be, make sure that you turn the lock on or screw the lock in. What that'll do is as you're using this ratchet, you're going to have a tendency to use this handle. If you don't lock it, it'll continue to move. And then once it continues to move, it'll be either adding or reducing the torque rating that this wrench is going to see. So make sure that when you go to use your wrench and you set your torque, that you go ahead and set the lock on it at the end of it so it doesn't change as you're applying torque to the wrench. The next thing, let's say you're working on some smaller bolts, or maybe like on the case of my motorcycle or the triple clamps. The readings are read out in inch pounds, so the torque settings for those bolts are in inch pounds. And you don't have this 1/4 inch torque wrench, which is only going to be used in inch pounds. One of the things that you can use is you can use your larger torque wrench. It's rated in foot-pounds, but what you have to use, and this is number 3 that you should be aware of with a torque wrench, there are online calculators that will take the inch to foot-pound conversions and do that for you. You would think that 12 inches is 1 foot and 24 inches is 2 foot. Isn't necessarily the case. It's a little more tricky than that in the conversion process when you're applying torque with a wrench. So make sure that you use an online converter to find out what your inch to foot-pounds reading should be if you're going to use a larger torque wrench and you don't have the smaller torque wrench rated in inch pounds. Okay, number 5, and a bit of a disclaimer here because I am probably guilty. Actually, no, I know I am guilty of this one. But when using your torque wrench, and because of sometimes where you're using your torque wrench, you really can't get a good pull on it. For example, if you're in your engine bay and you're bolting down cylinder heads and your engine bay is very cramped, it's tough to get this torque wrench into some of those lower cylinder head bolts and maybe get the 90 or 100 foot-pounds of torque that some of those lower bolts may call for. Whatever you do, do not be tempted to grab a pipe and put it on the end of your torque wrench to get more leverage on that. It'll completely throw off the actual torque reading. Not only that, but it's going to be hard to control it. So whatever you do, do not put pipes or extensions onto your torque wrench to try to get more leverage on it. One way or another, readjust it on the bolt, get a buddy who's a little stronger, get some help, something, but do not use external leverage on your torque wrench to try to add leverage to it. Number 6. Torque wrenches, remember what I said earlier about this being a ratchet, has a lever you can reverse it or tighten. Do not be tempted to use your torque wrench to loosen bolts, right? A lot of torque wrenches are only meant to read torque in clockwise rotations, which would be tightening your bolts for the most part, unless you have a left-handed threaded bolt. But do not be tempted to use this as a breaker bar. Yes, it's a long ratchet. Yes, it does have some leverage, but when you gotta break a bolt loose, it's really tight. Make sure that you use the correct tool, and that is a breaker bar, okay? Let's just consider this a specialty tool, right? This does not belong with your other ratchets. This is not even a ratchet. It is meant to measure torque, so please do not use the torque wrench to loosen your tight bolts. And number 7, when you're using your torque wrench, make sure that you use it and hold it properly. When you're using when you say you have a socket on your torque wrench, hold the head and the socket against whatever you're using with. I like to lift up on my torque wrench so I can actually feel the click before I hear the click. A lot of times if I'm using my tricep or I'm pushing down and I'm using all my body weight, I have a tendency to go past that torque. I'll hear the click and I'll keep pushing. If I'm lifting up on this ratchet, like I said, I'm much more in tune with what's going on. Also, if you have to add an extension to your torque wrench, maybe if you're doing, say, lug bolts or lug nuts on your car, make sure that you hold this head as you're rotating it. You want it to spin freely, but you want to support it. You don't want to let it just kind of flop out in the wind, because what it's going to do is it's going to affect the torque that you apply to the bolt. You may not be square, so one of the things you want to do is you want to hold the ratchet square and the bolt and the extension square to the nut or the bolt we're trying to take out, or to tighten, but just make sure you hold this properly. Like I said, this is knurled on the end for a reason. That's where your hand is supposed to be. You don't want to interfere with this part of the ratchet at all. This is where it rotates and the spring action takes place. Just at the head we want to support if we're using an extension or if we're in some place where we need to get some extra leverage on it. Next thing that's critical when using a torque wrench is to find out what the torque of the bolt should be. Typically a manual or anywhere online you can find torque settings for things. So make sure that you do a little research and find out what the torque should be. For example, on a set of cylinder heads, typically you'll start not only torquing the bolts, but the upper and lower bolts may have a different torque readings many times. So make sure you do your research, find out what the torque settings are, and use the proper tool to set the torque on those bolts. And finally, when you're done with your torque wrench, and if you're not going to be using it for a while, make sure that you back this lower knurled piece off to where it reads 0. It takes all the tension off of the spring in here. And then when you put it away, make sure that you put it in a sturdy box to protect it. You don't want to throw this thing in the bottom of your lower shelf of your toolbox where you're going to throw all your crescent wrenches and adjustable locking pliers and things of that nature. Make sure you store your torque wrench in a box. Most of them come with a good sturdy box, but if yours didn't come with one, maybe you got it secondhand, make sure you get one. All right, guys, if you follow those tips, your torque wrench will last you a long time and work as it should. Every toolbox should have a torque wrench. If you work on anything that burns gas or goes fast, someday you're going to need to torque a bolt. Better to have a torque wrench when you need it than when you want it. Thanks for watching, and until next time, keep the hammer down and keep it between the guardrails.